There is an unwritten rule among sailors. You do not touch the drowned. The CIA decided to break that rule. They built a machine to crack open a mass grave, proving that for intelligence agencies, nothing is sacred, not even death. The air in the office of Colonel General Pyotr Ivashutin smelled of stale tobacco smoke, lemon floor wax, and the imperceptible metallic tang of old radiator pipes. It was a smell unique to the headquarters of the GRU. A scent that seemed to preserve time like formaldehyde preserves dead tissue. Here, inside the thick walls of Soviet military intelligence, the chaotic noise of Moscow was reduced to a distant, meaningless hum. It was the morning of March 14, 1968. The light filtering through the tall frosted windows was pale and anemic, typical for early spring in the capital. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, swirling in complex turbulent patterns that obeyed the laws of physics but defied prediction. Ivashutin watched them with a heavy-lidded gaze. He sat alone at his massive mahogany desk, a piece of furniture that looked less like a workspace and more like a fortress rampart. Usually at this hour, the corridor outside his heavy oak door would be alive with the muffled rhythm of boots, the rustle of papers, and the low murmur of frantic intelligence chatter. The GRU was a machine that ran on information, and usually the gears ground loudly. But today the silence was absolute. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a pressurized vacuum. It was the kind of silence that precedes the crack of a rifle shot in a winter forest. Ivashutin drummed his fingers on the polished wood of the desk. The rhythm was irregular, a nervous staccato that betrayed the composure of his uniform. He was a man who had built a career on anticipating threats. He knew how to read the signs of an impending crisis. He did not need sirens or flashing red lights. He knew that disaster had arrived simply because the hallway had gone terrifyingly quiet. The people outside knew something, and they were afraid to bring it to him. The heavy oak door creaked open. It was a slow, hesitant movement. A junior aide slipped into the room. His face was drained of blood, his skin the color of wet parchment. He moved with the stiffness of a man marching to a gallows, his eyes fixed on the center of the general's desk. He did not speak. He did not salute. The ritual of military protocol had been suspended by the gravity of what he carried. He placed a single thin folder on the green baize surface. The paper was cream-colored, high-quality stock reserved for the highest echelons of the state. Against this neutral background, the red ink of the urgent stamp looked like a fresh arterial wound. Ivashutin stared at the code printed on the cover. Special message 412/K. He did not reach for it immediately. He let his hand hover over the cardboard cover. In the lexicon of naval intelligence, this specific code was not an operational update. It was not a request for supplies or a personnel transfer. The code 412/K was the bureaucratic equivalent of a funeral notice. It was a designation reserved for the catastrophic loss of contact with a strategic asset. With a slow, deliberate motion, Ivashutin flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the typewritten Cyrillic text. The characters were sharp and black, typed by a machine that did not care about the lives it was erasing. The K-129 had missed its mandatory check-in. Ivashutin closed his eyes for a second. He visualized the vessel. The K-129 was a diesel-electric Leviathan, a Project 629A submarine known to the NATO forces as a Gulf II class. It was a steel predator designed to prowl the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, carrying 3 R-21 nuclear ballistic missiles in its belly. It was not just a ship. It was a floating city of 98 souls, a piece of sovereign Soviet territory moving through the hostile deep. The report was sparse, terrifyingly so. The radio logs were clean. There had been no distress signal. There had been no sudden burst of encrypted static screaming for help. There was no emergency buoy transmitting a location. There was simply a void where a strategic asset should be. The timeline showed that the submarine had failed to send its scheduled burst transmission 2 consecutive times. In the strict, unforgiving rules of the submarine service, this was not an oversight. It was a death sentence. The silence from the boat screamed louder than any explosion. It implied a catastrophe so sudden and so violent that not a single man among the 98 had time to flip a switch. Ayvashyutin grabbed the secure telephone. The black bakelite receiver felt heavy and cold, like a piece of lead in his hand. He did not dial. The line connected instantly to the Naval Command Center. "Initiate the protocol," he barked. His voice was rough, breaking the stillness of the room like a hammer on glass. "Find it. Unleash everything we have. I want the entire Pacific Fleet at sea within the hour." The order traveled down the copper wires, turning electrical impulses into physical action. Within hours, the dormant beast of the Soviet Navy woke up. Thousands of miles away on the frozen coast of the Kamchatka Peninsula, the gray sky was torn apart by the wail of klaxons. The sound was mournful and dissonant, echoing off the concrete piers and the hull plating of moored warships. It was the sound of panic. The docks of Petropavlovsk and Vladivostok transformed from places of orderly maintenance into scenes of chaotic frenzy. Diesel engines coughed to life, belching thick plumes of black oily smoke that hung low over the icy water. The air filled with the acrid smell of unburnt fuel and the shouting of bosuns. Sailors ran along the wet steel decks, their breath steaming in the cold air, unlashing covers and preparing weapon systems. This was not a drill. The urgency in the officers' voices told the men that this was real. They were not deploying for a war game. They were deploying for a rescue mission that was rapidly turning into a salvage operation. Dozens of destroyers, cruisers, and supply ships cast off their lines. The water around the piers churned into white foam as propellers bit into the sea, pushing the heavy gray shapes away from the safety of the land. They formed up in the harbor mouth, a steel armada heading out into the open ocean. Ayvashyutin had commanded a saturation search. He was turning the Pacific Ocean into a hunting ground. The objective was desperate and clear. They had to find the needle before the ocean dissolved the haystack. The fleet tore into the Pacific. Their bows sliced through the freezing waves, sending sheets of salty spray over the bridges. They fanned out, covering thousands of square miles, converging on the last known coordinates of the K-129. Below the waterline, the ocean was subjected to a violent assault of sound. Active sonars pinged incessantly. The sound was a high-pitched electronic scream sent hurling into the abyss. Ping, ping, ping. It was a brute force method. The sound waves traveled through the water searching for something hard to bounce off. They were looking for the metallic echo of a hull, the distinct acoustic return that would separate a man-made object from the organic background of the sea. On the bridges of the destroyers, hydrophone operators sat in cramped, darkened booths. They pressed their heavy headphones to their ears until the cartilage ached and the skin bruised. They were the eyes of the fleet in a world where light did not exist. They listened through the static of biological noise, the clicking of shrimp, the groan of whales, the hiss of currents. They were listening for the sound of twisted steel, for the implosion of compartments, or for the rhythmic tapping of survivors against a hull. But the ocean offered nothing but indifference. The Pacific Ocean is a graveyard of unimaginable scale. It is a place where mountains taller than the Himalayas are hidden in eternal darkness. The water pressure at the bottom is enough to crush a truck into a metal cube the size of a suitcase. To the operators listening in the dark, the ocean sounded vast and empty. The active sonar pulses returned from the deep without touching anything but water. 2 weeks bled by. In Moscow, the pile of reports on Pyotr Ayvashyutin's desk grew taller. Each sheet of paper was a testament to failure. The sheer scale of the Pacific mocked the Soviet efforts. The fleet, which had looked so impressive leaving the harbor, now looked like a handful of plastic toys scattered in an enormous swimming pool. The K-129 had swallowed 3,000 tons of steel and 98 men without so much as a burp. Fuel reserves on the search ships began to run low. The destroyers had to slow down to conserve oil. The initial frantic energy of the crews, the desperate hope that they might find their comrades alive, curtailed into a grim, exhausting routine. They stared at empty gray horizons day after day. The sea was the same in every direction, a flat monotony that eroded the soul. The hope of rescue shifted steadily into the reality of recovery. And then, As the days turned into weeks, it shifted into the despair of total loss. There was no oil slick. There was no debris field. There were no bodies bobbing in life jackets. The submarine had simply ceased to exist. The scene shifted back to the Kremlin. The conference room was windowless, deep within the fortified walls of the citadel. The air was thick, almost blue with the smoke of Belomorcanal cigarettes. It was a heavy, pungent smell that clung to uniforms and hair. Men with gray faces sat around a long polished table. Their chests were heavy with medals, ribbons, and the gold stars of heroes. These were the masters of the Soviet military machine. They commanded tank divisions that could roll across Europe. They controlled fleets of strategic bombers that could turn cities into ash. But here in this room they looked defeated. Ivashutin stood at the head of the table. He presented the final damning report. "The search has yielded no results, comrades," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "We have combed the sector. We have used active and passive sonar. We have conducted aerial reconnaissance. The K-129 is gone." The admirals exchanged glances. The looks carried the weight of their impotence. They were powerful men used to bending the world to their will. But the water had defeated them. The ocean did not care about their rank or their medals. It had taken what it wanted, and it refused to give it back. "There is no salvageable wreckage," Ivashutin continued. "No survivors. And most critically, no location. We do not know where she lies." A high-ranking official from the Politburo sat at the center of the table. He picked up a fountain pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper sounded like a dry cough in the silence. He was signing the order to terminate the search. With that signature, he was effectively signing the death warrants of 98 sailors retroactively. He was closing the book on their lives. The file was stamped top secret and banished to a steel safe, burying the tragedy under layers of bureaucracy. They agreed on the lie they would tell the families and the world. The vessel was lost to the elements. It was a tragic accident, a malfunction, a cruel twist of fate. There was no culprit but the sea itself. It was a convenient lie. It saved face. It hid the incompetence of losing a nuclear weapon. And it allowed them to move on. But while the generals closed the book on the tragedy, one man was opening a new chapter. Victor Korzun sat in a cramped, cluttered office in the basement of Naval Intelligence. He was far removed from the mahogany desks and the high ceilings of the general staff. His office was a rat hole buried under tons of concrete. It smelled of cheap coffee, ozone from overheating electronics, and old paper. Korzun was an analyst. He was not a politician. He was a man who lived in the world of probabilities, physics, and mathematics. He did not care about medals or reputations. He cared about data. He was surrounded by charts. Bathymetric maps of the Pacific floor covered the walls, showing the jagged scars of trenches and the peaks of underwater mountains. Fuel consumption logs were stacked in precarious towers on his desk. Korzun was not satisfied with the official narrative of a mysterious disappearance. He pushed aside the finalized report, the one stamped with the official seal of the Kremlin. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. He refused to accept that a strategic nuclear asset simply evaporates into the ether. Submarines are big. They are noisy. They are made of matter. Matter does not vanish. He stood up and walked to the wall map. He ran his finger across the sprawling blue expanse of the Pacific, tracing the K-129's patrol route for the 100th time. He muttered to himself, calculating variables. He thought about the currents. He thought about the hull pressure limits. He thought about the fail-safe buoy systems designed to release automatically in the event of a sinking. His mind worked like a steel trap closing in on a discrepancy. If the submarine had imploded naturally due to a hull failure, the debris field would have been massive. The pressure wave of the implosion would have scattered lighter materials over miles. Oil would have risen to the surface, creating a slick visible from the air for weeks. And the sound. An implosion of a pressure hull at depth is one of the loudest events in the ocean. It is a violent acoustic event that travels for thousands of miles. The Soviet listening posts in Kamchatka should have picked it up. The Americans certainly would have picked it up. But the logs were empty. The ocean was silent. The math did not add up. The absence of evidence was to Korzun evidence of something far more sinister. A realization hit him, settling in his gut like a shard of ice. He stared at the empty patch of blue on the map, the unknown location where the sub vanished. He realized that the Soviet failure to find the wreck was not due to incompetence. The fleet had looked in the right place. They had used the right equipment. They had done everything correctly. They failed because the wreck was no longer where it should be. The ocean was too quiet. If a body falls in a forest and no one finds it, it is lost. But if a body falls in a room full of people and no one finds it, it has been moved. The Pacific Ocean during the Cold War was not an empty forest. It was a room full of listening devices. It was wired with hydrophones. It was patrolled by silent hunters. Korzun looked up from the map, his gaze hardening. He stared at the wall, imagining the view west toward America. He understood now. The K-129 wasn't just lost. It was taken. He whispered to the empty room, voicing the heresy that the Kremlin was too proud to admit. Someone else has found the grave. It was an impossible thought, a terrifying thought. To find a needle in a haystack is difficult. To find it before the owner does requires a knowledge that borders on the supernatural. The K-129 had not dissolved. It had been stolen. And there was only one power on Earth with the money, the technology, and the sheer chaotic ambition to attempt such a thing. The Americans. Korzun sat back in his creaking chair. The official report on his desk was trash. The generals were wrong. The tragedy was not over. The tragedy was just the prologue to a theft. The silence of the ocean implied that someone with better ears and deeper pockets had already visited the site. The Americans were the only ones crazy enough to try it. And if Korzun was right, they were about to commit the greatest grave robbery in human history. Time is a substance that behaves differently in the basement of the main intelligence directorate. On the streets of Moscow above, the seasons turned with a predictable rhythm. The gray slush of winter melted into the mud of spring, which hardened into the dust of summer before freezing once again. But down here in the archives of the G.R.U., time was not measured in seasons. It was measured in the accumulation of silence. 2 years had passed since the K-129 vanished into the Pacific. It was now 1970. The world outside had moved on. The Americans were busy putting men on the moon and fighting in the jungles of Vietnam. The Soviet Union was sinking deeper into the stagnation of the Brezhnev era, a time of heavy metals and slow rust. For the rest of the naval intelligence officers, the loss of the submarine had become a closed chapter, a tragic statistic filed away in a cardboard box. But for Victor Korzun, the calendar had frozen in March of 1968. He sat in the same cramped office. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets that were painted a depressing shade of industrial green. A layer of gray dust had settled on top of them, a physical manifestation of the indifference that now surrounded his investigation. The air in the room was stale, recycled too many times through clogged ventilation filters. It smelled of cheap bitter tobacco and the sharp chemical tang of frustration. Korzun was a ghost haunting a graveyard of data. While his colleagues chased new threats, tracking American carrier groups in the Mediterranean or monitoring listening posts in the Arctic, Korzun remained fixed on a blank spot in the Pacific Ocean. He was waiting. He did not know exactly what he was waiting for, but he knew the ocean well enough to know that it never keeps a secret forever. Eventually, a ripple would disturb the surface. Eventually, the thief would make a mistake. The door opened without a knock. A courier from the interpretation center stood in the doorway holding a heavy manila envelope. He looked bored. To him, this was just another delivery, another packet of paperwork moving from one desk to another in the endless bureaucracy of the state. He dropped the envelope onto Korzun's desk with a dull thud. Fresh batch from the Zenit satellites, the courier said, stifling a yawn. They said you wanted anything covering the American East Coast shipyards. Seems like a waste of film to me, but orders are orders. Korzun did not look up until the door clicked shut. He reached for the envelope. His hands were steady, but his heart beat a little faster. He pulled the red string that sealed the flap and slid the contents out onto his desk. They were photographs, large glossy black and white prints that smelled faintly of developing fluid. They were grainy, high-contrast images stolen from the skies above the United States. The resolution was coarse, limited by the technology of the time and the miles of atmosphere between the lens and the ground, but to a trained eye, they offered a window into the enemy's backyard. Korzun spread them out under the harsh yellow light of his desk lamp. The coordinates printed in the corner of the first image identified the location as Chester, Pennsylvania, just south of Philadelphia. This was the home of the Sun Shipbuilding and Drydock Company. Usually, this shipyard was a place of mundane industrial construction. They built oil tankers. They built cargo freighters. It was a place of commerce, not conspiracy. But as Korzun looked at the center of the drydock, his eyes narrowed. There was something in the frame that did not belong. He leaned in closer, squinting against the glare of the lamp. The shape rising from the drydock floor was massive. It blotted out the surrounding cranes and scaffolding. It was a hull of immense proportions, but it possessed none of the sleek hydrodynamic lines of a military vessel or the functional blockiness of a tanker. It was a monstrosity. Korzun reached into his drawer and pulled out a heavy brass magnifying glass. He hovered the lens over the print, bringing the grain into sharp focus. The vessel looked like a confused hybrid, a nightmare born of engineering madness. It looked like someone had taken a deep-sea oil drilling platform and welded it onto the hull of a skyscraper. The Americans had christened it the Glomar Explorer. Korzun studied the silhouette. The ship was long, nearly 600 feet from bow to stern. But it was the superstructure that was unsettling. It was too tall. It was too wide. The proportions were wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of Korzun's neck stand up. In naval architecture, form follows function. A destroyer looks like a knife because it needs to cut through the water. A carrier looks like a flat airfield because it needs to launch planes. This ship did not look like it was designed to sail. It looked like it was designed to stand still. It was a beast born of deception, a floating paradox that seemed to be hiding its true purpose in plain sight. He opened a secondary dossier that had been clipped to the back of the photographs. It was a background check on the owner of the vessel. The name at the top of the file was typed in bold Cyrillic letters. Howard Hughes. Korzun lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the cone of light from the lamp. He knew the name. Everyone in intelligence knew the name. Howard Hughes was not just a billionaire. He was a phantom. He was the dark prince of American capitalism. The report described a man who had long since severed ties with reality. Hughes was a recluse rotting away in a blacked-out penthouse in Las Vegas. His mind was reportedly eroded by a cocktail of morphine and madness. He had not been seen in public for years. He was a man who bought airlines on a whim and influenced presidents with a phone call. He was the perfect American grotesquerie, a man whose infinite wealth allowed him to indulge in insanity without question. According to the intelligence briefing, Hughes had publicly announced a new venture. He was pivoting from aviation and movies to deep-sea geology. The Glomar Explorer, the report stated, was a mining vessel. Korzun scoffed, blowing a stream of smoke at the paper. Mining. He picked up a sheaf of press clippings that had been included in the file. They were translations of articles from American newspapers. The story being spun by the Hughes public relations machine was elaborate and exciting. It claimed that the ocean floor was covered in manganese nodules. These were described as potato-sized rocks rich in manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. The narrative was perfect for the Western public. It was a gold rush for the modern age. It was a bold commercial stride into the abyss led by a maverick genius. The story promised that the Glomar Explorer would vacuum these rocks up from the seabed, solving the world's metal shortage and making Hughes even richer. Korzun took a red grease pencil and circled the word manganese. He tapped the paper aggressively, leaving a small red dot on the page. It was too convenient. It was too mundane. In the world of intelligence, a boring story is often the strongest armor. If you tell people you are building a secret weapon, they will dig until they find the truth. But if you tell them you are digging for rocks, they will yawn and look away. The story of the manganese nodules was designed to make curious people stop asking interesting questions. It was a sedative administered to the global press. But Victor Korzun was not the global press. He was a man who looked for the lie in every sentence. He returned to the satellite photos, pushing the press clippings aside. He focused his magnifying glass on the center of the ship. Rising from the middle of the deck was a massive drilling derrick. It was a lattice of steel girders that towered hundreds of feet into the air. Korzun compared its height to the standard oil rigs he had seen in other reconnaissance photos. This derrick was different. It was thicker. It was heavily reinforced with cross-bracing that suggested it was built to handle colossal vertical loads. He noticed the complex machinery at the base of the derrick. Even from the blurry orbit of the satellite, he could make out the shapes of heavy-duty gimbals and hydraulic rams. This was a heave compensation system designed to keep the derrick perfectly steady even while the ship rolled and pitched in the ocean swell. Why would a mining ship need such stability just to suck up loose gravel? A vacuum hose is flexible. It does not need a rigid tower. It does not need a derrick built like a fortress. The physics of the structure screamed of heavy lifting. This derrick was not designed to pull up slurry or mud. It was designed to lift a dead weight. It was built to hold something steady against the heaving chest of the Pacific Ocean. Korzun slid the magnifying glass down to the waterline of the ship. He examined the belly of the beast. The shadows in the drydock revealed the outline of a massive set of internal doors in the center of the hull. He grabbed a pair of dividers and measured the dimensions against the known scale of the surrounding dock workers. He did the conversion in his head. The doors were colossal. They opened into a moon pool, a giant internal opening that went straight through the bottom of the ship. Korzun calculated the volume of the space inside. It was an internal hangar large enough to swallow a cathedral. It was large enough to conceal a medium-sized warship. He sat back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. A mining ship needs a conveyor belt. It needs a hopper to store the rocks. It needs a suction hose. It does not need a bomb bay the size of a football field. It does not need a derrick capable of lifting thousands of tons. The architecture of the Glomar Explorer was a lie constructed in steel. Every rivet and girder was part of a deception. Korzun pushed the photos to the side of his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a notepad and a slide rule. He needed to attack the cover story with the one weapon that never lied: mathematics. He began to calculate the construction costs of such a specialized behemoth. He estimated the tonnage of the steel. He estimated the cost of the custom hydraulics, the computerized positioning systems, the labor of thousands of workers. He scribbled numbers furiously, the graphite tip of his pencil snapping under the pressure. The total came to at least $350 million. It was a staggering sum. It was the GDP of a small nation. Korzun then cross-referenced this number with the current market value of manganese and nickel. He consulted a trade ledger from the Ministry of Economy. The price of manganese was low. The market was flooded. He ran the numbers. Even if the Glomar Explorer worked 24 hours a day for a decade sucking up every rock on the ocean floor, the harvest would barely scrape $1 million a year in profit. He looked at the two numbers on his notepad. Cost $350 million. Return $1 million. The return on investment was functionally zero. In fact, it was a catastrophic loss. Korzun stared at the red ink of the deficit. The silence of the basement office seemed to press in on him. He knew the psychology of Western capitalism better than he knew his neighbors in his apartment block. He had studied their greed. He knew that American billionaires like Howard Hughes were predators. They were sharks that swam in oceans of money. They did not throw $1/3 billion into the water for a hobby. They did not build fleets to lose money. They demanded profit or they demanded power. There was no profit in manganese nodules. The rocks were worthless. Therefore, the Glomar Explorer had not been paid for by a businessman looking for a return. It had been paid for by a wallet deeper than Hughes's. It was funded by a wallet that did not care about market returns or shareholders or quarterly reports. It was funded by a wallet that cared only about strategic acquisitions. Korzun stood up and began to pace the small office. The smoke from his cigarette trailed behind him like a thought bubble. He realized that Howard Hughes was merely a prop. He was a scarecrow set up in the field to distract the crows while the farmer worked the soil. The madness of the billionaire was the perfect camouflage. No one questions a crazy man burning money on a fever dream. If a rational corporation built this ship, the stockholders would revolt. But Hughes was allowed to be crazy. The manganese mining story was a curtain, thick and heavy velvet draped over the stage to hide the actors moving the scenery behind it. Korzun stopped pacing. He turned to the large map of the Pacific that dominated the far wall. He looked at the empty spot where the K-129 had vanished. He looked at the coordinates where 3,000 tons of Soviet steel lay rusting in the dark. He visualized the Glomar Explorer floating above that specific coordinate. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a violence that made him dizzy. The derrick was not a drill. It was a winch. The moon pool was not a hopper. It was a cargo hold. The ship was not a vacuum cleaner. It was a claw. The Americans were not planning to scrape the bottom of the world for rocks. They were planning to reach down 3 miles into the crushing dark. They were building a giant floating hand to pick the K-129 up off the ocean floor and carry it away. The audacity of the plan made Korzun's breath catch in his throat. It bordered on lunacy. It was a heist so grand and so impossible that only a superpower could dream it up. It was a robbery that would cost more than the Apollo space program. Korzun walked back to his desk. He slammed his hand down on the photograph of the Glomar Explorer, pinning the steel beast under his palm. He spoke into the silence of the room, articulating the impossible truth for the first time. They are going to steal it. He looked at the grainy image of the derrick. It no longer looked like an oil rig. It looked like a Tomb Raider's tool. The game had changed. For 2 years, Korzun had thought he was conducting a search mission. He thought he was looking for a grave. But now he realized he was witnessing a crime in progress. The K-129 was not lost. It was waiting to be collected. And Victor Korzun, sitting alone in the basement of the GRU, realized with a cold shiver that he was the only man in Moscow who saw the thief standing in plain sight. The fluorescent lights in the conference room of the Rubin Design Bureau hummed with a low, irritating frequency that seemed to vibrate inside Victor Korzun's skull. The room did not look like a center of naval espionage. It looked like a university workshop where brilliance was measured in coffee stains and pencil shavings. The air was thick, hot, and smelled intensely of stale roasted beans and the sharp ozone tang of photocopiers. Victor sat on a hard wooden chair. Across from him sat 3 men who looked nothing like the spies Korzun was used to dealing with. There were no trench coats, no shadowed brims, and no cryptic whispers. These were naval architects. They wore woolen sweaters that had seen better days, and their fingers were permanently stained with blue ink and graphite. They were the men who designed the silent killers of the Soviet fleet, but today they looked like confused librarians. On the table between them lay the reconstructed blueprints of the Glomar Explorer. The paper was smooth and white, covered in a spiderweb of black lines and calculations. The chief engineer, a man with thick spectacles that magnified his eyes into bewildered orbs, smoothed out the sheet with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts or original manuscripts. He ran a calloused hand over the drawing of the ship's midsection. Victor watched him closely. He needed a verdict. He needed science to confirm what his gut was already screaming. The chief engineer looked up. His face was pale. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, leaving a smudge of ink on his skin. It is not a minor, Comrade Korzun. The engineer spoke softly, but the words landed with the weight of a hammer. He pointed a shaking finger at the center of the diagram. We have analyzed the structural load paths. We have looked at the power distribution. A mining vessel is a vacuum cleaner. It sucks up slurry. It needs pumps. It needs storage tanks. This ship has none of those things. This ship is a hydraulic jack. It is a floating crane built to lift a dead weight of colossal proportions. Victor felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Hearing it from a specialist made the nightmare real. "Show me," Victor said, leaning forward. "Show me how it works." The engineers began to walk him through the anatomy of the machine. They spoke in a language of stress tensors and shear forces, but Victor translated it into the language of theft. They pointed to the center of the ship where a massive derrick towered over the deck. To the untrained eye, it looked like an oil rig, but the engineers showed him the base of the tower. It sat on a complex system of hydraulic rams and gimbals. "This is a heave compensation system," the second engineer explained, tracing the lines with a mechanical pencil. "The ocean is never still. It breathes. It rolls. If you are trying to drill for oil, you need to keep the bit steady. But this system is over-engineered by a factor of 10. It is designed to hold a pipe string perfectly rigid even if the ship is pitching in a 20-foot swell. It turns the chaotic surface of the Pacific into a concrete platform." Victor watched their hands move over the diagrams. They were describing a mobile fortress, an engineering marvel designed to wrestle with gravity itself. "And here," the chief engineer said, tapping the belly of the ship, "this is the smoking gun." He pointed to the moon pool. It was a massive rectangular opening in the bottom of the hull. 2 sliding doors, each the size of a tennis court, could close to seal it off. "Why would you need a hangar this size inside a mining ship?" the engineer asked rhetorically. "If you are mining manganese nodules, you dump them on a conveyor belt. You do not need a garage. You only need a garage if you are bringing something up in one piece. Something large. Something you do not want the world to see." Victor stared at the empty rectangle on the paper. It was a void waiting to be filled. Then the chief engineer revealed the final piece of the puzzle. He pulled a second sheet of paper from a folder. It was a sketch based on the dimensions of the moon pool and the lifting capacity of the derrick. "If the pipe string is the fishing line," the engineer said quietly, "then this is the hook." He pushed the sketch toward Victor. It was a drawing of the capture vehicle. Based on the geometry of the ship's internal bay, the engineers had deduced what the device at the end of the pipe must look like. It was a claw. It was a mechanical hand the size of a 5-story apartment building. It had massive steel fingers operated by high-pressure hydraulic pistons. It was a monstrosity of industrial design, a gripping machine built to descend into the abyss and crush whatever it touched. Victor visualized the steel beast hanging in the black water. He imagined the hydraulic jaws opening in the crushing darkness 3 miles down. The realization created a physical reaction in him. A chill crawled up his spine as the true purpose of the machine clicked into place like a locking bolt in a rifle. It was not a tool for geology. It was a tool for abduction. Victor left the Rubin Design Bureau with the blueprints rolled up under his arm. He walked through the gray streets of Leningrad, barely noticing the biting wind or the crowds of people rushing to catch trams. His mind was thousands of miles away, deep in the Pacific. He returned to his office and unrolled a bathymetric chart of the sector where the Glomar explorer was heading. The map was a tapestry of blue contour lines showing the ridges and trenches of the ocean floor. Victor lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. He inhaled the smoke, letting the nicotine settle his nerves. He began to cross-reference. The engineers had estimated the lifting capacity of the Glomar Explorer at roughly 2,000 tons. It was a specific number. Engineering is rarely random. You build a machine to do a specific job. You do not build a truck to carry 10 tons if you only need to carry 5. Victor scanned the geological data for the target area. Manganese nodules. He laughed. A dry, humorless sound that died in the silence of the office. Manganese nodules are scattered across the seabed like pebbles. They do not clump together in 2,000-ton boulders. There is no geological formation in that entire sector that requires a heavy lift capability. You could harvest the nodules with a bucket on a string. He looked at the coordinates again. There was only one object in that specific square of the ocean that fit the weight profile. There was only one object that weighed roughly 2,000 tons when filled with water. There was only one object that justified a $350 million expenditure. The Americans were not fishing for rocks. They were hunting for the steel corpse of the K-129. Victor sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He tried to comprehend the vertical scale of the operation. The sheer audacity of it was paralyzing. He grabbed a paper napkin from his desk and uncapped his fountain pen. He drew a line at the top. The surface. He drew a line at the bottom. The seabed. Between them lay 5,000 meters of water. To explain the depth to himself, to truly visualize the madness of the American plan, he began to stack buildings in his mind. He imagined the Empire State Building. It was the symbol of American ambition, a tower of steel and Art Deco stone. It was nearly 400 meters tall. Victor drew a tiny stick figure of the building on the napkin. Then he drew another one on top of it. And another. He had to stack the Empire State Building 12 times to bridge the gap between the keel of the Glomar Explorer and the hull of the submarine. 12 skyscrapers stacked end to end, hanging in a void of crushing darkness. The Americans intended to lower a steel pipe through that distance. They intended to thread a needle in the dark while floating on a shifting ocean. It was a heist that defied the natural order. It violated the laws of physics as much as it violated international law. It was an act of hubris so profound that it bordered on godhood. But it was not just the technical genius that struck Victor. It was the moral weight. The realization hit him harder than the engineering data. This was not just about stealing technology. This was not just about codes or cipher machines or nuclear warheads. It was grave robbery on an industrial scale. The K-129 was not just a piece of hardware. It was a tomb. Inside that crushed steel hull lay 98 Soviet sailors. They were fathers. They were sons. They were husbands. By the sacred traditions of the sea, they were at rest. They had paid the ultimate price for their country, and the ocean had claimed them. Now the Americans were planning to crack open their crypt and drag it into the sunlight. Victor felt a surge of nausea mixed with awe. The CIA was coming for the nuclear missiles, yes, but they were willing to disturb the sleep of the dead to get them. They were willing to desecrate a mass grave for an intelligence advantage. It was a violation of the unwritten rules that existed between sailors, even enemies. You do not touch the drowned. Driven by a mixture of patriotic duty and professional horror, Victor secured a meeting with the Soviet High Command. It took him 3 days of calling in favors, of threatening junior officers, and pulling every lever of influence he had accumulated in his career. Finally, he was granted an audience. He walked into the Ministry of Defense on Frunzenskaya Embankment. The building was a temple of Soviet power. The corridors were wide enough to drive a tank through. The floors were parquet, polished to a mirror shine that squeaked under his boots. The conference room was grand, paneled in dark oak that had absorbed the secrets of the Cold War for decades. The air was heavy with the scent of floor wax, expensive cologne, and old power. At the far end of a long table sat a row of generals. They looked like a tribunal of gods. Their uniforms were immaculate, the green wool tailored to hide the paunches of middle age. Their chests were heavy with ribbons from the Great Patriotic War, rows of colorful silk that told stories of Berlin and Stalingrad. They looked at Victor not as a visionary but as a nuisance. To them, he was just a nervous analyst interrupting their lunch. He was a man with ink on his fingers coming to lecture men with blood on their hands. Victor took a deep breath. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He steeled himself, clutching the roll of blueprints like a shield. He prepared to lay out the impossible truth. He stood before a large wall map of the Pacific Ocean. He picked up a wooden pointer, the polished stick feeling light and flimsy in his hand. "Comrade generals," Victor began, his voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. "What I am about to tell you sounds impossible, but the evidence is irrefutable." He traced the trajectory of the Glomar Explorer. He spoke of the satellite photos. He spoke of the moon pool and the derrick. He used the words capture vehicle with urgent precision. "The Americans," he said, "are building a straw. They are building a straw to suck the secrets out of the ocean floor. They have located the wreck of the K-129, and they are coming to take it." He explained the mechanics. He explained the heave compensation. He explained that the ship was a stable platform designed to bypass the protection of the deep. He watched the faces of the generals. He expected shock. He expected anger. He expected them to pound the table and demand immediate countermeasures. He expected fear. Instead, he saw the corners of mouths twitching. He saw a glance exchanged between a marshal of the Soviet Union and an admiral of the fleet. It was a look of shared amusement. It was the look parents give each other when a child tells a story about a monster in the closet. Victor felt his heart sinking. To them, he sounded like he was reading a script from a bad science fiction novel. He was talking about giant claws and 3-mile-long pipes. He was talking about things that did not exist in their world of tanks and artillery barrages. A heavy-set general sitting in the center of the table leaned back in his chair. He was a hero of Stalingrad, a man who had stopped German panzers with his bare will. His eyebrows were thick and gray, like 2 fuzzy caterpillars resting on his forehead. He let out a bark of laughter. It was a loud, harsh sound that shattered Victor's momentum. It bounced off the oak paneling and seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The general dismissed the report with a wave of his large, meaty hand. "Comrade Korzun," the general rumbled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "You have a vivid imagination. I will give you that. You should write for the cinema." The room erupted in chuckles. The tension broke, replacing the atmosphere of warning with one of ridicule. "This is an American fairy tale," the general continued, smiling indulgently. "A giant claw? To lift a submarine from 5 kilometers? Do you know how much steel weighs, Korzun? Do you know what happens to a pipe that long when you try to hang it in the water? It snaps under its own weight." "But the blueprints," Victor tried to interject. "Drawings," the general scoffed. "The Americans are experts at disinformation. They want us to panic. They want us to waste millions of rubles chasing phantoms. This ship is a mining vessel, or maybe it is a listening post. But a grave robber? No, it is physically impossible." The generals began to lecture Victor. They treated him like a junior cadet who had failed his introductory physics exam. They spoke of the nature of the ocean. "Comrade," the admiral said, leaning forward and clasping his hands, "at that depth, the pressure is 500 atmospheres. It turns submarines into crushed soda cans. It is a hostile environment. It is the best defense we have." They were convinced that the physics of the deep were immutable. To these men, the ocean was an impenetrable wall. It was a fortress built by nature to protect their secrets. They believed that because the Soviet Union could not recover the submarine, then surely the Americans could not either. They were blinded by their own limitations. They projected their own technological struggles onto the enemy. They trusted the water more than they feared the American ingenuity. Victor listened to them explaining why he was wrong. He heard the arrogance in their voices, the fossilized certainty of men who had won a war 30 years ago and stopped learning. He packed up his charts. His hands were trembling, not from fear now, but from suppressed rage. He looked at the generals. He saw the metals glinting under the chandelier. He saw the confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. "They see the Pacific as a shield," Victor thought bitterly. "The Americans see it as a problem." That was the terrifying difference. The Kremlin believed the ocean was a wall. The Americans had used their wealth to build a door. Victor realized he was the only man in the room who respected the enemy enough to understand them. He was the only one who understood that for a country with enough money and enough madness, the word impossible was just a challenge. "I have warned you," Victor said quietly. His voice was lost in the shuffling of papers as the generals prepared to move on to the next agenda item, which likely involved tank production quotas or parade formations. He turned and walked out of the oak-paneled room. The laughter of the Stalingrad general followed him to the door, ringing in his ears like tinnitus. Victor Korzun walked out of the Ministry of Defense and into the gray afternoon. The Moscow air was cold and smelled of diesel fumes and wet pavement. He stood on the steps of the massive building, feeling small and insignificant. He felt the crushing weight of impending disaster. It was a physical pressure pressing down on his shoulders. He knew He knew that at this very moment, thousands of miles away in the warm sun of the Pacific, the Glomar explorer was steaming towards the target. He knew the derrick was being raised. He knew the pipe was being prepped. He had given the Soviet High Command the truth on a silver platter, and they had thrown it back in his face. They were safe in their arrogance, protected by their belief in the impossible. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He struck a match, cupping the flame against the wind. The flare of the match was bright and brief. He looked up at the leaden sky. Somewhere in the Pacific, a giant steel hand was already reaching down into the dark, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The corridors of the main intelligence directorate in Moscow had changed. In 1968, they had been filled with the sharp staccato of confident footsteps and the loud barking voices of men who believed they owned the world. But by the summer of 1974, the acoustics of the building had shifted. The air was no longer electric with arrogance. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with a silence that felt like a physical weight. Victor Korzun walked down the long hallway on the third floor. The parquet floor beneath his boots squeaked softly, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet atmosphere. He passed an open door where two generals stood conferring in hushed tones. A few years ago, these same men would have been slapping their thighs and laughing until they choked at the absurdity of the American plan. They would have called it a fairy tale. They would have called it science fiction. Now, they did not laugh. When they saw Korzun approaching, they stopped talking. They averted their gazes, pretending to study the papers in their hands. They looked at him with a mixture of resentment and fear. He was the man who had brought them the bad news, and like all messengers of doom, he had become a pariah. The intelligence reports on Korzun's desk were no longer tossed into the trash or used as coasters for tea mugs. They were stamped with the red ink of urgent. They were whispered about in the corner offices where the smoke of expensive cigarettes hung low over the mahogany desks. The skepticism had curdled into dread. The Soviet leadership had finally woken up to the reality that the Glomar explorer was not a joke. It was a predator, and it had arrived at the hunting ground. Thousands of miles away from the gray skies of Moscow, the Pacific Ocean was a canvas of deep bruised purple. The water here was deep, so deep that it swallowed the light and gave nothing back. The Glomar explorer slowed to a halt. It was a massive vessel, a floating island of industry that looked utterly out of place in the empty expanse of the sea. Usually, a ship in the open ocean is at the mercy of the waves, rolling and pitching with the rhythm of the swell. But this ship did not roll. Along the hull beneath the waterline, a series of powerful side thrusters fired in short, violent bursts. The water around the ship churned into a white froth as the dynamic positioning system fought against the ocean. The computer brain of the ship, sensing the slightest drift, fired the engines to keep the vessel perfectly still. It was a violent act of stability. The ship was pinning itself to a single geographic point, fighting the wind and the current to remain motionless over a specific patch of nothingness. They were not guessing. The Americans knew exactly where to park. Thanks to the S.O.S.U.S. hydrophone network, the secret ears of the United States Navy, they had pinpointed the exact acoustic anomaly. They had heard the death rattle of the K-129 6 years ago. Now, the massive ship hovered directly over the grave, a steel tombstone marking a spot the Soviet fleet had spent months searching for in vain. Deep in the belly of the ship, the preparations began. The center of the Glomar explorer was hollow. It was built around a massive internal cavern known as the Moon Pool. It was a hangar the size of a cathedral concealed behind steel walls. The air inside was thick with humidity and the heavy cloying smell of hydraulic fluid and grease. High-pressure hoses snaked across the deck like black pythons. The shift supervisor gave the order, and the massive doors in the floor began to grind open. The sound was a low mechanical groan that vibrated through the soles of the crew's boots. Slowly, the steel plates retracted, revealing the ocean below. The calm water of the moon pool churned and slapped against the sides of the opening. The crew looked down into the square of turquoise water. To the uninitiated, it looked like a swimming pool. But the men standing on the edge knew better. They knew that beneath that shimmering surface lay 3 miles of hostility. They were looking into the throat of the abyss. This was the start of the quietest battle of the Cold War. There were no explosions or jet engines here, only the hum of generators and the intense laser focus of men preparing to violate the laws of nature. Suspended above the open moon pool hung the machine that would do the dirty work. The engineers called it the capture vehicle. The crew who had spent months welding and testing it had given it a more affectionate name. Clementine. Clementine was unlatched from its steel cradle. As the locking pins retracted, the machine settled onto the winch cables with a heavy metallic clank. Floodlights washed over its frame, illuminating a mechanical nightmare of girders, sensors, and talons. It did not look like a piece of modern technology. It resembled the skeleton of a prehistoric beast, a dinosaur of steel and hydraulics dug up from the future. It was 5 stories tall. The massive claws hung limp and open, ready to bite. The sheer scale of the machine was disorienting. It was a skyscraper's foundation built to travel to the bottom of the world. The winches engaged. The cables hummed with tension. Slowly, Clementine began to lower. The tips of the steel talons touched the water, breaking the surface tension. The ocean swallowed the machine without a splash. Inch by inch, the capture vehicle disappeared into the turquoise water, beginning its long, lonely commute into the void. The descent was not a simple drop. You cannot just lower a cable 3 miles deep. A cable that long would stretch, spin, and eventually snap under its own weight. The engineers had to build a bridge of steel pipe 1 section at a time. On the derrick floor, the roughnecks went to work. They were men with oil-stained coveralls and arms thick with muscle, moving with the rhythmic trance of a well-oiled machine. A 60-foot section of high-strength steel pipe was swung into position. The heavy threads were greased with thick black dope. The roughnecks guided the pipe into the coupling, spinning it down until it bit. Then the massive hydraulic tongs clamped on, applying thousands of foot-pounds of torque to seal the connection. Clank, spin, torque, drop. It was a grueling, repetitive ritual of industrial precision. The sun beat down on the deck, baking the steel and the men alike. Sweat dripped from their noses onto the hot metal. They worked in a haze of noise and heat, unaware that just a few hundred feet below them, the pipe was entering a world where the temperature hovered near zero. Each connection was a potential point of failure. A single stripped thread, a single microscopic crack could send the entire assembly plummeting into the dark. Section by agonizing section, the pipe string lengthened. The derrick groaned as it took the weight, pushing Clementine deeper into the crush. Below decks in the Mission Control Center, the atmosphere was different. There was no sweat or grease here, only the cool hum of air conditioning and the flickering glow of telemetry screens. The mission controllers watched the data streams, acutely aware of the impossible physics at play. To them, the operation was a terrifying act of balancing chaos. The chief engineer rubbed his eyes, trying to banish the fatigue. He tried to explain the difficulty to a CIA observer standing in the back of the room. "Imagine standing on top of the Empire State Building," he said, his voice low. "Now imagine there is a hurricane blowing. You are trying to lower a sewing thread to the sidewalk. And at the end of that thread, you have to hook a walnut." He paused, watching the numbers on the depth gauge tick upward. "Except the walnut weighs 2,000 tons and is leaking radiation. And the wind is actually ocean currents moving in 3 different directions at once." The pipe string acted like a noodle over such a vast distance. It did not hang straight down. It flexed and bent, dancing with the hidden currents of the deep. The capture vehicle at the bottom could be hundreds of feet away from the ship's vertical axis, swinging like a pendulum in slow motion. The tension in the control room was palpable. They were trying to thread a needle with a sledgehammer while wearing blindfolds. Clementine descended past the twilight zone. The light from the surface faded away, turning from blue to black. The machine entered the abyssal plane, a world of eternal night that had not seen a photon of light since the Earth cooled. The pressure here built to terrifying levels. 500 atmospheres. It was enough pressure to snap human bones like dry twigs. It was enough to compress styrofoam cups into tiny thimbles the size of a fingertip. The water itself was compressed, packed tight by the weight of the ocean above. The cameras mounted on the claw flickered to life, sending back grainy black and white images to the surface. The screens showed a snowstorm. It was marine snow, organic detritus, dead plankton, and waste drifting down from the surface like nuclear fallout. It swirled in the darkness, illuminated by the lights of the intruder. The claw hung there, an alien presence in a world that belonged to nightmare biology. It swayed gently at the end of its 3-mile-long steel leash, hunting for the shape of the dead. The calendar on the bulkhead of the control room read July 4th, 1974. It was Independence Day. Back in the United States, families were gathering for barbecues. Children were running with sparklers. Fireworks were bursting over city skylines in celebrations of freedom and noise. But aboard the Glomar Explorer, there were no fireworks. There was only the grinding of winches and the groaning of steel. The tension aboard the ship had tightened to a breaking point. The crew moved with hushed urgency, their faces drawn and serious. They were aware of the irony. On the day their nation celebrated its birth, they were about to commit the greatest act of larceny in human history. The celebration was internal, a burning knot of anxiety in the stomach of every engineer. There were no speeches. There was no music. There was only the depth gauge ticking down the final few meters to the seabed. Target depth approaching, the sonar operator called out, his voice cracking slightly. 50 feet. 40. Suddenly, the telemetry screens flared white. The powerful strobe lights on Clementine washed over the ocean floor, cutting through the eternal gloom. The shadows danced and lengthened, revealing the landscape of the abyss. It was a barren plain of gray silt, undisturbed for millennia. And then there it was. A collective gasp went through the control room. It was a sound of shock mixed with reverence. The K-129 lay in the silt. It was a shattered, rusting hulk. The steel hull was torn and twisted from the violence of the implosion 6 years ago. It looked like a discarded soda can crushed by a giant's hand and thrown into the mud. It was a ghost ship, a mausoleum of Soviet secrets. Seeing the target turned the abstract mission into a terrifying reality. Up until this moment, it had been a math problem. It had been coordinates and tonnage. But looking at the broken spine of the submarine, seeing the jagged metal where the compartments had been ripped open, brought the truth home. They were hovering directly over the grave of 98 men. The operators in the control room forced themselves to focus. They pushed aside the thoughts of the dead sailors inside. They had a job to do. Shift starboard 10 feet, the guidance officer commanded. Forward 5. The massive ship on the surface miles above fired its thrusters. The pipe string flexed, transmitting the movement down to the bottom. On the screen, Clementine moved. The shadow of the claw fell over the wreckage. With a low electrical hum, the capture vehicle settled over the submarine. It was a slow, delicate movement. The massive steel fingers guided by sonar and video slid into the mud around the hull. The alignment was perfect. The claw cradled the broken sub like a mother holding a child. Engage hydraulics. The operator pressed the command. In the deep silence of the ocean bottom, the hydraulics screamed. Millions of pounds of pressure forced the talons to bite. They dug into the seabed, wrapping around the broken spine of the submarine. The steel tips met beneath the hull, locking together. The trap was sprung. The thief had his hand in the pocket. Now came the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. The breakout. The K-129 had been embedded in the abyssal clay for 6 years. It had settled deep into the silt. The mud had formed a seal, a bond of suction that held the submarine fast. Breaking that seal required overcoming not just the weight of the sub but the grip of the earth itself. Initiate lift. Slow. Very slow. The winches on the Glomar Explorer began to turn. The pipe string tightened. The ship sat lower in the water. The hull groaned, protesting the impossible load. The engines roared, increasing their pitch to counter the weight dragging them down. Down below, the mud fought back. It held onto its prize, refusing to let go. The tension gauges in the control room spiked into the red zone. The needle climbed higher and higher, approaching the catastrophic failure point. For a terrifying minute, the entire operation hung in the balance. The steel pipe sang a high-pitched note of stress, a frequency that vibrated through the deck plates. If the pipe snapped now, the recoil would destroy the ship. It would cut the Glomar Explorer in half like a guillotine. The crew held their breath. They watched the needles. They prayed to the gods of metallurgy. And then, with a shudder that vibrated through the entire ship, the suction broke. A massive cloud of silt exploded underwater, billowing out like a mushroom cloud in slow motion. It obscured the cameras, blinding the operators for a moment. But the sensors told the story. The load stabilized. The weight was free. The K-129 lifted free from the bottom. Slowly, impossibly, the dead began to rise. The submarine, still cradled in Clementine's steel fingers, started its long journey back to the world of the living. It left a crater in the mud, a scar on the ocean floor that would remain for centuries. The heist was active. They had stolen the tomb. Now they had to carry it 3 miles up through the currents and the cold without dropping it. The easy part was over. The long haul had just begun. The ascent settled into a nerve-shredding rhythm of mechanical torture that seemed to stretch time itself into a thin wire. Inside the control room of the Glomar Explorer, the air had become a physical substance, heavy and opaque. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke that had been recycled through the ventilation system until it tasted like charcoal. It smelled of nervous sweat and the sharp chemical tang of spilled coffee drying on Formica consoles. The winch operators sat hunched over their controls like monks at prayer. Their eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the red fatigue of a shift that had lasted too long. They did not blink. They stared at the tension gauges where the needle trembled in the red zone, dancing dangerously close to the line that marked catastrophic failure. Every rotation of the massive drums sent a deep resonant vibration through the deck plates. It was not just a sound. It was a feeling that traveled up through the soles of their boots and settled in the marrow of their bones. It was a constant reminder of the dead weight hanging 3 miles below them. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. The submarine was not being lifted so much as it was being coaxed meter by perilous meter out of the gravity well that had claimed it 6 years ago. The pipe string was fully extended and loaded. It behaved less like a hollow steel tube and more like a piano wire pulled to its absolute breaking point. It sang. It was a high-pitched, mournful note that could be felt in the teeth of the crew members standing on the derrick floor. It was the sound of metal molecules screaming as they were stretched apart. Outside, the wind coming off the Pacific howled through the rigging. It whistled through the lattice of the derrick, blending with the mechanical groan of the ship. But the crew ignored the weather. They were focused entirely on the physics fighting back against them. The sheer mass of the K-129, combined with the drag of the water, was stretching the high-strength steel to its limit. The ocean currents pushed against the pipe, bowing it like the string of a giant bow. The heavy lift system was fighting a war on 2 fronts, holding the weight up while struggling to keep the load vertical against the lateral force of the sea. 3 miles below the surface, the K-129 was fighting its own silent battle against structural integrity. The Soviet submarine was a corpse that had been rotting in a saltwater grave for 6 years. The initial explosion that sank her had already compromised the hull, shattering the titanium-strengthened spine of the vessel. Time and chemistry had done the rest. Corrosion had eaten away at the rivets and welds, turning the once mighty warship into a brittle shell. It was a mosaic of rust held together by habit and mud. As the water pressure decreased during the ascent, the physics of the environment began to change. The trapped pockets of air and water inside the wreck began to expand. They pushed against the weakened steel from the inside out, probing for weakness like a prisoner testing the bars of a cell. The telemetry screens in the Mission Control Center flickered with green light. They indicated that Clementine and her burden had passed the 2,000-meter mark. They had reached the halfway point. A ripple of cautious optimism spread through the control center. It was not a cheer. It was a collective exhale. The shift supervisor, a man with a face etched by years of oil field grit, wiped his forehead with a grease-stained rag. He allowed himself a brief moment of hope. They had dragged the prize out of the abyssal plain. They had lifted it out of the crushing dark and brought it into the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone. The water temperature outside the hull was rising slightly. The crushing darkness was beginning to lessen, turning from absolute black to a deep, impenetrable indigo. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the audacity of the plan might actually pay off. It seemed as though the impossible heist was actually going to work. Suddenly, the rhythmic hum of the operation was interrupted. It was a violent, discordant shudder. It started at the winch drum and traveled down the entire length of the pipe string like a shockwave moving through a whip. On the bridge, the captain grabbed the brass railing to steady himself as the floor beneath him lurched. It felt as though the ship had run aground on a reef in the middle of the open ocean. The tension gauges in the control room flickered wildly. The needles danced erratically, swinging from maximum load to zero and back again in the blink of an eye. The computers screamed alarms, flashing red warnings across the screens. It was not a mechanical failure of the ship. The engines were fine. The thrusters were holding station. It was a shift in the load below. The Glomar Explorer groaned in protest. The steel of the hull complained with a loud screeching sound as the weight distribution underwent a sudden terrifying change. A sound tore through the ship. It was loud enough to be heard over the roar of the generators and the crashing of the waves against the hull. It was a sharp, concussive crack. It sounded like a gunshot from a high-caliber rifle fired inside an empty cathedral. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the gut. It was the sound of high-tensile steel surrendering to gravity. Every man on the deck froze. Their heads snapped toward the moon pool. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. The noise was visceral, vibrating in their chests. It was the distinctive, sickening report of a catastrophic structural failure occurring miles beneath their feet. They knew that sound. It was the sound of something expensive and heavy dying. 2 kilometers down in the crushing pressure of the midnight zone, the structural integrity of the K-129 finally gave way. The submarine had been designed to withstand pressure from the outside in, not the twisting forces of being lifted by a claw. The corroded keel, unable to support the weight of the waterlogged missile compartment any longer, sheared in two. The sound of the metal tearing was muffled by the ocean, but the violence of the break was absolute. The submarine snapped like a dry twig stepped on by a giant boot. The jagged edges of the steel screamed as they tore apart, severing the hydraulic lines and electrical cables that had once been the nervous system of the ship. The structural spine of the Soviet Leviathan had been severed. Clementine, the massive mechanical claw, was designed to cradle the entire hull. It was built to hold a cylinder, but it could not compensate for the sudden loss of rigidity. As the submarine broke, the balance of the load was destroyed. The rear 2/3 of the vessel, the heavy section, shifted violently. This was the section that mattered. It contained the diesel engines. It contained the encryption room with the codebooks. And most importantly, it contained the silos with the nuclear missiles. The steel fingers of the claw scraped uselessly against the disintegrating hull. Sparks would have flown if there had been air, but here there was only the grinding of metal on metal. With a final silent lurch, the heavy stern section slipped free from the grasp of the metal giant. It slid out of the cradle like a bar of wet soap slipping from a hand. The liberated section of the K-129 began its long tumbling freefall back to the abyss. It was a slow-motion disaster. The section containing the nuclear warheads and the codebooks, the crown jewels of the mission, spiraled down into the dark. It trailed a cloud of rust and silt behind it like a comet's tail. It crashed through the water column, picking up speed as it returned to the crushing pressure it had just escaped. The sensors on the Glomar Explorer watched the tragedy unfold in real time. The operators watched the ghostly green blob on the sonar screen separate into 2 pieces. They watched the larger piece fade away, shrinking smaller and smaller until it vanished back into the digital noise of the bottom of the world. On the surface, the Glomar Explorer reacted instantly to the sudden loss of thousands of tons of weight. The ship bucked upward. It bobbed cork-like in the swells as the suspension cables went slack. The sudden motion knocked coffee cups off consoles, sending black liquid splashing across the floor. Loose tools skittered across the deck, clattering against the bulkheads. The winch engines whined as the resistance disappeared. They spun freely for a terrifying second, the gears screaming before the emergency brakes slammed home. The physical sensation for the crew was one of sickening weightlessness, followed by the heavy stomach-churning realization of loss. The ship settled back into the water, but it rode higher now. Felt lighter. It felt empty. The shift supervisor stared at the underwater video feed, his face draining of color until it matched the gray paint of the bulkhead. The camera mounted on Clementine showed the aftermath. The claw was still holding something, but it was pitifully small compared to the original target. Clementine was clutching only the forward nose section of the submarine. It held the torpedo room and the crew quarters. It was a twisted, jagged fragment, a piece of scrap metal compared to the strategic treasure they had just lost. The rear section was gone. The entire reason for the $800 million expenditure had slipped through their fingers. The missiles were gone. The cryptographic machines were gone. They had caught the wrapper, but they had dropped the candy bar. A heavy silence descended on the control room. It was heavier than the pressure of the deep. It was heavier than the steel they had just lost. The mission director looked at the millions of dollars of equipment surrounding him. He looked at the years of planning, the blueprints, the cover stories, and the sheer audacity of the attempt. He realized the bitter irony of the result. They had performed the greatest engineering feat in maritime history. They had built a ship that could reach the bottom of the world. They had found a needle in a haystack. They had hooked it. They had lifted it. But they had failed in the final mile. They were left holding a rust bucket full of torpedoes and tragic ghosts. Meanwhile, the nuclear secrets of the Soviet Union, the prize that would have tipped the balance of the Cold War, settled back into the mud. They were safe once again in the arms of the Pacific, protected by the crushing depth that had claimed them in the first place. The operators turned off the active sonar. There was no point in tracking the falling debris. It was gone. The ocean had taken back what belonged to it. The heist was over, and the only thing they had to show for it was a handful of wreckage and a story that no one would ever believe. The massive steel doors of the moon pool began to grind shut. The sound was a low mechanical thunder that vibrated through the hull of the Glomar Explorer, sealing the ocean out and trapping the captured fragment inside. As the heavy plates locked together, the pumps roared to life. Millions of gallons of seawater were sucked out of the cavernous hangar and spat back into the Pacific. As the water level dropped, the smell hit them. It was not the smell of the sea. It was something older, something darker. The cavern filled with the stench of the deep, a primordial rot-like smell of ancient mud and decay that had been compressed for 6 years under 500 atmospheres of pressure. It was the smell of a tomb that had been violently cracked open. On the gantry above, CIA operatives stood dressed in protective yellow hazmat suits. Their respirators rasped with every breath, sounding like the labored breathing of dying men. They stared down into the gloomy wet cavern. The strobe lights flickered, illuminating the twisted dripping wreckage of the K-129's nose section. It sat on the cradle like a broken tooth extracted from the jaw of a giant. The operatives descended the metal stairs, their boots clanging on the grating. They moved cautiously, Geiger counters in hand. The devices clicked furiously, sounding like a swarm of angry insects warning of the radiation that clung to the hull. This was the moment they had spent $800 million to reach. This was the harvest. They pried open warped hatches with crowbars, the metal groaning in protest. They sliced through crushed bulkheads with acetylene torches. The blue flames hissed, casting dancing shadows on the rusted steel, making the interior of the submarine look like a flickering underworld. They tore through the command center. They rifled through lockers, pulling out soggy logbooks that disintegrated in their gloved hands. They cracked open safes, hoping to find the golden ticket. But the silence in the room grew heavy. The codebooks were not there. The cryptographic machines were missing. The KGB officer's safe, which should have held the launch codes, was gone. The rear section of the submarine, the heavy tail that had snapped off and fallen back into the abyss, had taken the secrets with it. The adrenaline of the heist evaporated instantly, replaced by the hollow metallic taste of failure. They were standing inside the most expensive empty box in history. Pushing deeper into the wreck, the search team moved into the torpedo room. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, illuminating tangled piping and crushed steel. Then the lead operative stopped. He held up a hand, signaling the others to freeze. Lying amidst the wreckage, half buried in silt and twisted metal, were bodies. There were 6 of them. They were preserved in the near-freezing stasis of the abyss, protected from decay by the cold and the lack of oxygen. They did not look like the faceless red menace depicted in American propaganda posters. They looked like boys. They were young men with pale waxy skin. They wore the distinctive striped telniashka undershirts that sailors wear the world over. One of them still had a photo of a girl in his pocket, preserved in plastic. In the claustrophobic silence of the wreck, the political ideology stripped away. There were no capitalists or communists here. There were only mariners who had died in the dark. The CIA men lowered their flashlights. The professional detachment of the spy gave way to the universal tragedy of the sea. Word of the discovery traveled up to the bridge. It changed the atmosphere of the ship instantly. The mission commander was a hardened intelligence officer, a man who had spent his life fighting the shadow war against the Soviet Union. He looked at the reports on his desk. He looked at the failure of the intelligence gathering. And then he looked at the report on the casualties. He made a decision that defied the cold logic of the Cold War. Secure the intelligence gathering, he ordered, his voice quiet but firm. Initiate mortuary protocols. Treat them with respect. The mood on the ship shifted from a high-stakes heist to a solemn wake. The frenetic energy of the search was replaced by a somber duty. These men were no longer targets. They were no longer assets to be exploited. They were fellow sailors who had been disturbed from their rest. The laws of the sea are older than the laws of nations, and those laws demand respect for the drowned. On September 4, 1974, the crew of the Glomar Explorer assembled on the fantail. The sky was a flat slate gray, merging with the horizon of the Pacific. The wind whipped across the deck, carrying the salt spray. The CIA operatives had traded their oil-stained coveralls for dress uniforms. They stood rigid in formation, their brass buttons gleaming dull in the overcast light. In the center of the deck stood a burial platform. On it rested 6 steel coffins. Draped over the coffins was a flag. It was not the stars and stripes. It was the hammer and sickle. The ship's sailmaker had stitched it together from spare canvas and red dye, working late into the night to get the dimensions right. It was a surreal tableau. American spies standing at attention to honor the soldiers of the enemy they were sworn to destroy. The ship's loudspeakers crackled to life. There was no siren. There was no announcement. Instead, the swelling brassy notes of the Soviet national anthem began to play. The music drifted out over the empty ocean. A strange elegy played for an audience of seagulls and spies. The majestic chords seemed to fill the emptiness of the Pacific, challenging the wind. An American chaplain stepped forward. His surplice flapped in the wind. He opened his prayer book, his voice fighting to be heard over the waves. He read the service for the burial of the dead at sea. He spoke the prayers in English, the familiar words of comfort and commendation. Then he paused. He looked down at a piece of paper in his hand. He began to speak in Russian. He stumbled through the phonetic translation, his accent thick and clumsy. But the intent bridged the linguistic divide. He was speaking the language of the dead men, bridging the gap between East and West with the universal language of grief. At a signal from the captain, the honor guard stepped forward. They lifted the edge of the burial platform. One by one, the weighted coffins slid out from under the Soviet flag. They tipped over the edge and plunged into the ship's wake. Splash, splash, splash. There was a brief swirl of white foam, a moment of disturbance in the water, and then the Pacific swallowed them again. The Americans saluted, holding their hands to their brows until the last ripple faded. They had returned the 6 sailors to the deep. They had not returned them as debris or biological waste. They had returned them as warriors sent home with full military honors. When the news of Project Azorian finally broke months later, the reaction in the Kremlin was not the anger the Americans expected. It was terror. It was a profound, bone-deep terror that chilled the blood of the Soviet high command. The generals who had once laughed at Victor Korzun in the Ministry of Defense now sat in stunned silence. Their laughter had turned to ash in their mouths. The Americans didn't get the codes. They didn't get the missiles. But they had achieved something far more frightening. They had proved that the ocean floor was no longer a sanctuary. For decades, the Soviet strategy relied on the belief that the deep ocean was a wall. They believed their submarines could hide in the abyss, safe from prying eyes. But the Glomar Explorer had shattered that illusion. If the United States could reach down 3 miles to steal a submarine, they could do anything. They could tap undersea cables. They could plant sensors on the ocean floor. They could recover test missiles. The technological gap was laid bare, and it was a chasm. The wall was gone. The ocean was transparent. Years bled into decades. The Cold War thawed and then evaporated. The Berlin Wall fell, crumbled by the hammers of a new generation. The maps were redrawn. The Red Empire that had spanned 11 time zones dissolved into history, leaving behind a legacy of rust and memory. Victor Korzun watched his world crumble from the window of a small drafty apartment in Moscow. The new Russia felt like a stranger to him. It was loud, chaotic, and full of neon signs advertising Western goods. His uniform hung in the closet wrapped in plastic. The medals on the chest were tarnished relics of a superpower that couldn't save itself. He was an old man now. His hands shook when he poured tea. He lived on a pension that barely bought bread, surrounded by the ghosts of the fleet he once served. The K-129 was a distant memory, a scar on his conscience that had faded with time but never truly healed. Then, in October 1992, a package arrived. It was sent to the Russian government from Robert Gates, the director of the CIA. It was a gesture of goodwill, a bridging of the gap between the old enemies. Inside the package was a VHS cassette. Copy found its way to Victor Korzun. He sat in his cramped living room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the radiator hissed in the corner. He pushed the tape into the machine. The mechanical whir of the VCR was the only sound in the room. The tracking lines flickered on the screen, dancing in gray static. Then the image stabilized. It showed the grainy sun-bleached deck of the Glomar Explorer. Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He saw the gray horizon of the Pacific. He saw the rows of men in dress uniforms. He saw the coffins. And then he saw the flag. He watched the ceremony unfold on his television. He heard the crackle of the loudspeakers. He heard the first notes of the Soviet anthem. Victor froze. He listened to the music that had been the soundtrack of his life, played on the deck of an enemy ship. He saw the American chaplain reading the prayers. He saw the officers saluting. He saw the care, the absolute rigid respect with which the Americans treated his fallen comrades. For the first time in his life, the icy cynicism of the intelligence analyst melted. The hard shell he had built around his heart to survive the purges and the paranoia cracked. Tears tracked through the deep lines of his face. He did not wipe them away. He realized that in that moment on the fantail of the Glomar Explorer, the Americans were not thieves. They were not imperialists. They were not the enemy. They were brothers of the sea. They understood the cost of the ocean. They understood that when a sailor dies, he belongs to no nation. He belongs to the water. Victor Korzun stood up and turned off the television. The screen faded to black, leaving a white in the center that slowly vanished. He sat in the dark. He listened to the wind rattle the window pane. He thought of the K-129 lying 5 kilometers down in the crushing silence. He realized the ultimate truth of the Cold War. Flags rot. The red dye fades in the salt water. Empires collapse under their own weight. Codes become obsolete, broken by computers that fit in a pocket. But the ocean remains. The ocean does not care about borders. It does not care about ideologies or 5-year plans or stock markets. It is a vast, indifferent graveyard where the pawns of superpowers sleep together in the dark. They are united by the crushing pressure and the silence. They are waiting for a judgment that will never come. And in the end, perhaps that is the only peace any of them will ever find.